How do cultural changes influence global power dynamics? I want you to think about that for a second. We are so used to looking at maps and seeing borders, hard lines, permanent colors, countries that seem like they have always been there and always will be. But those borders are a lie. The real forces that shape our world are invisible. They are the ideas, the values, the art, the music, the stories that a society tells itself. And here is the thing. These cultural currents move faster than any army. Long before a nation becomes a superpower, something shifts in its culture. Take the Renaissance. Before Europe dominated the globe, before its navies and its empires, there was a cultural explosion. A rediscovery of knowledge, a celebration of human potential. That cultural shift didn't just produce great paintings. It produced a new kind of confidence, a new way of thinking about the world. And that thinking eventually translated into political and economic dominance. So the question is not just who has the biggest military today. The question is, whose culture is quietly reshaping the future? Now let me break this down with a specific example that changed everything. The printing press. Johannes Gutenberg finished his press around 1450, and within 50 years, 8 million books had been printed across Europe. That is not just a technological fact. That is a cultural earthquake. Before the press, information was controlled by a tiny elite, the church, the monarchy, the universities. If you wanted knowledge, you had to access it through them. After the press, anyone with a few coins could own a book. They could read the Bible for themselves, interpret it in their own way. And that is where the real shift begins. Think about literacy rates. In 1500, somewhere around 10% of adult males in Europe could read. By 1600, that number had jumped to about 30% in urban centers. In some cities like Geneva or Strasbourg, literacy among men reached nearly 60%. Compare that to the rest of the world. In the Ottoman Empire, literacy was probably under 5%. In China, where printing had existed for centuries, it was maybe 10 to 15% among the elite. But the difference was scale and distribution. Europe was not just printing more books, it was printing them in vernacular languages: German, French, English, Italian, not Latin. That meant ordinary people could read about philosophy, science, politics, religion in their own tongue. And that changed everything. Here was what I mean. The Reformation was not just a religious dispute. It was a cultural revolution made possible by the printing press. Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to that church door in 1517, and within 2 years, his ideas had spread across Germany. By 1520, he had published over 30 pamphlets. Total circulation? Hundreds of thousands of copies. People were reading them, discussing them, arguing about them in taverns and market squares. The authority of the church was being questioned by people who had never been to a university. And that questioning did not stop at religion. It spread to politics, to economics, to the very idea of who should rule. So let me give you a specific date to anchor this. 1525, the German Peasants' War. Tens of thousands of peasants rose up against their lords, inspired by Reformation ideas about equality and justice. They lost, badly. An estimated 100,000 people lost their lives. But the cultural shift was already underway. The idea that ordinary people had a voice, that they could challenge authority, that their beliefs mattered. That idea did not die in the fields. It spread. And it eventually led to the rise of nation-states. Because here is the key insight. Cultural shifts do not just change what people think. They change how people organize themselves. In the 16th century, as literacy spread and religious authority fractured, people began to identify with something larger than their local village or their feudal lord. They started to see themselves as English or French or German. National identity was born, and with that identity came the nation-state, a centralized government that could tax, raise armies, build infrastructure, project power. The printing press did not create nationalism overnight, but it gave it the tools to spread: a shared language, a shared history, shared stories printed in books that everyone could read. And this is where it gets interesting. The cultural shift that produced the nation-state also produced the conditions for global dominance. Because nation-states could mobilize resources on a scale that feudal kingdoms never could. They could build navies, fund exploration, establish colonies. By 1700, Europe was not just a collection of squabbling kingdoms. It was a system of powerful, centralized states competing for control of the world. And that competition was driven by the cultural changes of the previous 2 centuries. So think about the numbers. In 1500, the global economy was roughly equal between Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. By 1800, Europe controlled about 35% of the world's GDP. That is not a coincidence. That is the result of cultural shifts that began with a printing press and a few pamphlets. The ideas came first, the power followed. And that pattern, cultural change leading to political and economic dominance, has repeated itself again and again throughout history. So when we talk about the rise of new superpowers today, we need to ask the same question. What cultural shifts are happening right now that we are not seeing? Because the next superpower is probably being built not in a parliament or a military base, but in the minds of its people. But let's jump forward a few centuries, because the same pattern plays out in a completely different context. I am talking about the 20th century, specifically after World War II. And here's the angle that most people miss. Everyone knows the United States became a superpower because of its economy and its military. But those things were built on a foundation that was not economic at all. They were built on a cultural shift. Think about what happened in America after the war. The country was not just rebuilding Europe at the Marshall Plan, it was exporting a way of life. And that way of life was built on 2 things that seem simple, but are actually revolutionary: individualism and consumerism. Now I know those words get thrown around a lot, but let me show you what they really meant in practice. The Marshall Plan started in 1948. Over 4 years, the United States sent about $13 billion to Western Europe. That is roughly $150 billion in today's money. But here's what people forget. The money came with strings attached. Not political strings in the obvious sense, but cultural ones. To receive aid, European countries had to open their markets, adopt American-style business practices, and embrace the idea that economic growth came from consumer spending, not state control. That was a radical idea in a continent that had spent decades under rationing and central planning. And then came the products: Coca-Cola, Levi jeans, Hollywood movies, jazz music, later rock and roll. By 1950, American films accounted for about 65% of box office revenue in Britain and nearly 70% in France. That is not just entertainment, that is a cultural curriculum. Every movie taught Europeans a lesson about American values: individual freedom, personal choice, the idea that happiness comes from what you buy and who you become, not from your class or your family background. Now contrast that with the Soviet Union. The Soviets had their own cultural export. It was called socialist realism. State-approved art that glorified the worker, the collective, the party, and it was everywhere. By the 1950s, the Soviet Union was producing over 1,000 feature films a year, most of them propaganda. But here's the problem. Nobody wanted to watch them. In East Germany, Soviet films averaged about 10% of the market share. American films, smuggled in or shown in restricted venues, were wildly popular. The same thing happened with music. Soviet authorities banned jazz in the 1940s, calling it bourgeois decadence. But young people in Moscow and Leningrad were listening to it on illegal radios anyway. And this is where the cultural shift becomes a power shift, because the Soviet Union could not compete on the cultural front. Its system was built on control, on uniformity, on the idea that the state knows best. That works for a while, especially when you have a secret police and a closed border. But it does not create the kind of soft power that makes people in other countries want to be like you. And soft power is not some abstract academic concept. It is the ability to shape what other people want. When a teenager in Cairo or Jakarta watches an American movie, they do not just see a story, they see a lifestyle. They start wanting the same things: blue jeans, rock music, a car, a house with a lawn. Those desires eventually translate into political alignment. Let me give you some numbers to make this concrete. In 1950, the United States had about 6% of the world's population, but produced roughly 50% of its manufactured goods. By 1960, American companies had invested over $11 billion in Western Europe alone. That is not just capital. That is infrastructure tied to American values. Every factory, every franchise, every McDonald's that opened in the 1960s and 70s was a cultural ambassador. The Soviet Union tried to counter this with things like the World Festival of Youth and Students, which brought thousands of young people to Moscow. But it was too little, too late. By the 1980s, Soviet citizens themselves were watching bootleg American movies on VHS tapes smuggled in from Poland. And here's the key insight that ties back to what we talked about earlier. The cultural shift toward individualism and consumerism did not just make America powerful, it made the Soviet Union weak. Because the Soviet system could not adapt. It was a culture of scarcity trying to compete with a culture of abundance. And in that competition, the abundance always wins. The Berlin Wall did not fall because of tanks. It fell because of a cultural longing for blue jeans and rock music and the freedom to choose your own life. That is the real lesson of the 20th century. The superpower that controls the cultural narrative, that shapes what people want, that makes its way of life seem inevitable. That is the superpower that lasts. And that is exactly why this channel exists, to help you see the invisible forces that are shaping our world right now. If you want to understand where power is moving before everyone else does, hit that subscribe button and join ABIS Media. We are building a community of curious minds who want to understand the real story behind culture, history, and the rise and fall of superpowers, because the next big shift is already happening, and you deserve to see it coming. Now, let me zoom across the map to a different part of the world, because the same pattern is playing out right now in front of us, and most people are missing it. I'm talking about China. And here is the thing that a lot of Western analysts get wrong. They look at China's rise and they see factories, infrastructure, military spending. But those are symptoms, not causes. The real engine of China's ascent is a cultural renaissance that has been quietly building for decades. Think about what happened in the 1990s. After the Tiananmen Square incident in 1989, China was isolated. Its economy was still small, its cultural influence was basically zero. But then something shifted. The government started pouring money into education, but not just any education. They revived Confucian values. By the early 2000s, Confucian classics were back in the school curriculum. Students were memorizing passages from the Analects, learning about filial piety, social harmony, the importance of hierarchy and order. This was not just nostalgia. It was a deliberate strategy to build a cultural identity that could compete with the West. And it worked. By 2010, China had over 200 million students in its education system, more than the entire population of most countries. And those students were being taught to see themselves not as individuals, but as part of a collective, a civilization with a 5,000-year history. That is a powerful cultural narrative. It gives people a sense of purpose and belonging that Western individualism often fails to provide. Now look at the numbers on cultural diplomacy. The Belt and Road Initiative, which started in 2013, is often described as an infrastructure project. Roads, ports, railways across Asia, Africa, and Europe. But it is also a cultural project. Every new railway line comes with a Confucius Institute. By 2019, there were over 500 Confucius Institutes in more than 150 countries. These are not just language schools. They are cultural embassies. They teach Chinese calligraphy, history, philosophy. They sponsor exchange programs. They create a generation of foreign students who see China not as a threat, but as a source of opportunity and wisdom. And here is where it gets interesting. Compare that to the American approach. The United States has the Peace Corps, which is great, but it is small. In 2020, the Peace Corps had about 7,000 volunteers. China's Confucius Institutes, by contrast, had over 20,000 teachers and staff. And the reach is different. The Peace Corps sends Americans to teach English and build wells. Confucius Institutes send Chinese teachers to teach Chinese culture and language. The goal is not just development, but the real cultural shift is happening through technology and entertainment. TikTok. You have probably heard the statistics. By 2020, TikTok had over 2 billion downloads worldwide. It is the most downloaded app in history. But here is what most people do not realize. TikTok is not just a platform. It is a cultural Trojan horse. The algorithm is designed by Chinese engineers. The content moderation policies reflect Chinese values. And the aesthetic, the short, fast-paced, visually driven format, is perfectly suited to a generation that has grown up with smartphones. When a teenager in Brazil or Nigeria spends 3 hours a day on TikTok, they are not just watching dance videos. They are absorbing a Chinese-designed way of consuming information. And then there is cinema. In 2019, the Chinese film The Wandering Earth grossed over $700 million, mostly in China. But that is not the interesting part. The interesting part is what the movie is about. It is a science fiction epic where humanity survives a solar crisis by working together under a centralized authority. Compare that to Hollywood, where the hero is always an individual who saves the day by breaking the rules. The cultural message is completely different, and that message is being exported. By 2023, Chinese films were earning over $1 billion annually in overseas markets, up from almost nothing a decade earlier. Now let me give you a specific number that captures the scale of this shift. In 2000, China had about 1,000 foreign students studying in the country. By 2019, that number had exploded to nearly 500,000. That is 500,000 future leaders, diplomats, and business people who have spent years living in China, learning the language, making friends, absorbing the culture. When they go back to their home countries, they carry that influence with them. And here is the key insight that ties back to everything we have talked about. The cultural shift in China is not about making people want to be Chinese. It is about making the Chinese way of life seem normal, even inevitable. Just like American consumerism seemed inevitable in the 1950s. Just like European nationalism seemed inevitable in the 1800s. The goal is not to convert everyone. It is to change the terms of the conversation. And it is working. So when you hear about China's rising GDP or its expanding navy, remember that those are built on a foundation of cultural confidence. A confidence that was deliberately cultivated over decades. And that is the real story. The next superpower is not being built in a factory or a shipyard. It is being built in classrooms, on smartphone screens, and in the minds of a generation that has never known a world where China was not rising. So let me shift the lens completely, because the future does not look like the past. The next superpower might not be China or the United States. It might be a country that most people still think of as poor, chaotic, or irrelevant. I am talking about India. And here is the number that should make you sit up and pay attention. By 2023, India had a population of over 1.4 billion people. It has officially surpassed China as the most populous country on Earth. The population alone is not power. What matters is the demographic dividend. India has one of the youngest populations in the world, with a median age of about 28 years. Compare that to China at 38, the United States at 38, Japan at 48. That is a massive advantage. A young population means a growing workforce, more consumers, more innovators. It means a country that is not stuck paying for an aging population's healthcare and pensions. It means energy, ambition, and cultural dynamism. And India is already exporting its culture on a scale that most people do not realize. Bollywood. In 2022, the Indian film industry produced over 2,000 films, more than any other country in the world. Bollywood movies are watched across South Asia, the Middle East, Africa, and increasingly in the West. The global box office for Indian films hit about $1.5 billion in 2022, and that number is growing fast. But it is not just about movies. Yoga. There are over 300 million yoga practitioners worldwide, and most of them do not realize they are participating in an ancient Indian tradition. The Indian government has actively promoted yoga as a cultural export. In 2014, the United Nations declared June 21st as International Day of Yoga. That is soft power on a global scale. When a CEO in New York or a housewife in Sao Paulo starts their morning with a sun salutation, they are connecting with Indian culture in a deeply personal way. Then, there is the digital revolution. India has over 700 million internet users, second only to China. But here's the difference. India's digital infrastructure is built on open platforms, not state-controlled ones. The Unified Payments Interface, or UPI, has revolutionized digital payments. In 2022, UPI processed over 74 billion transactions, more than any other digital payment system in the world. That is not just a technological achievement, it is a cultural shift toward a cashless, digital-first society. And Indian tech companies are taking that model global. By 2023, UPI was being adopted in countries like Singapore, the UAE, and France. When a tourist in Paris pays for a croissant using an Indian-designed payment system, that is cultural influence in action. But the real cultural shift in India is happening through its diaspora. There are over 32 million people of Indian origin living outside India, one of the largest diasporas in the world. And they are not just taxi drivers or shopkeepers anymore. Indian origin CEOs run some of the biggest companies on the planet: Google, Microsoft, Adobe, and more. Indian origin politicians hold high office in the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, and New Zealand. When Kamala Harris became Vice President of the United States, that was not just a political milestone. It was a cultural signal. The Indian diaspora is becoming a global elite, and that elite carries Indian values, Indian cuisine, Indian music, Indian spirituality into the corridors of power. Now let me add another layer: the African continent. This is where the next big cultural shift might be brewing. By 2050, Africa's population is projected to reach 2.5 billion, about a quarter of the world's total. And that population is overwhelmingly young. The median age in Africa is around 19 years. Think about that. Half of Africa's population is under 19. That is an entire continent of teenagers and young adults who are growing up with smartphones, social media, and global connectivity. They are not isolated. They are plugged into the same cultural currents as teenagers in London or Tokyo, and they are creating their own culture. Look at the rise of Afrobeats. Music from Nigeria, Ghana, and South Africa is now a global phenomenon. In 2022, Afrobeats streams on Spotify grew by over 200% year-on-year. Artists like Burna Boy, Wizkid, and Davido are selling out arenas in London, New York, and Paris. That is not just music. It is a cultural declaration. It says Africa is not a place of poverty and conflict. It is a place of creativity, joy, and confidence. And that cultural confidence is spilling over into other industries. Nollywood, the Nigerian film industry, produces over 2,000 films a year. Its global reach is growing. African fashion, African literature, African art are all gaining international recognition. And here is the economic projection that grounds this speculation. The African Continental Free Trade Area, launched in 2021, aims to create a single market of 1.3 billion people, with a combined GDP of over $3 trillion. If it succeeds, Africa could become the world's largest free trade zone. That is not just an economic shift, it is a cultural one. When goods, services, and people move freely across borders, ideas move too. A young entrepreneur in Nairobi can collaborate with a designer in Lagos and a manufacturer in Accra. That creates a Pan-African identity that did not exist before. But there is a catch. Cultural shifts do not guarantee success. They create potential. India's youth bulge could become a liability if jobs are not created. Africa's cultural renaissance could be crushed by political instability or climate change. The point is not to predict the future, it is to see the patterns. The same pattern that played out in 16th century Europe, in 20th century America, and in 21st century China is now playing out in India and Africa. Cultural confidence, demographic energy, and technological connectivity are combining to create new centers of gravity. And the countries that recognize this, that invest in their own cultural narratives, that export their values and their stories, will be the ones that shape the next century. And that brings us back to the question we started with. How do cultural changes influence global power dynamics? They are the engine, the quiet force beneath the surface of history, shaping what people believe, what they want, how they organize. From the printing press to Hollywood to TikTok, the pattern is unmistakable. Ideas come first. Power follows. Right now, somewhere in the world, a new cultural shift is brewing. A new story, a new way of seeing the world. And that shift will eventually produce the next superpower. The only question is whether you are paying attention. If this perspective matters to you, hit subscribe and join ABIS Media. We explore the big picture, the long view, the stories that explain how we got here and where we are going. The next cultural shift is already happening. The best way to see it coming is to stay curious.